Hi, good morning, everyone. It's so nice to see all of you in person. And for those of you that are joining us via Zoom, we're so happy that you can be here. We are all very excited. I know I am. I know all of you are to be here today listening to Dr. Mamoto, who is joining us today to be our guest lecturer. And we want to thank Dr. Marge Calarco. If we could give her a round of applause for being here and supporting us in our community of nursing. Um, I joke with Marge that when I get compared to Marge every so often, it's like makes my day because I think that's a really high compliment. I know you all feel the same way. So welcome. You are an alumni, of course. So she was just commenting on how large the health system has grown since she was last here. And we are now, we have the most recent count somewhere between 7,500 and 8,000 nurses strong. So we are so excited to have you here and welcome to the University of Michigan. Can we give a round of applause, please?
Good afternoon, good morning. Can everyone hear me okay? Perfect. Well, thank you all, and thank you, Julia. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. And um, as Julia mentioned, I'm Suzanne Miyamoto. I am the CEO of the American Academy of Nursing, a role that I've had for the last 6 years. And I wanted to take the time today to talk a little bit about driving impact through very courageous connections. And with that, I have to say thank you to Dr. Calarco and her incredible leadership and inviting me to be here in the lectureship in her honor. I had a chance to do a little research on Dr. Calarco's career, and we have like two ships passing because we were at Michigan at different times, but also at the same time. And one of the things that I found were these words: that her leadership inspires, that she is a true patient advocate, that she strives for excellence, and that she has courage. And so I thought, when I was preparing my discussion for today, how could I weave in the themes that are so impactful of your career into what we can aspire to as leaders throughout our career? I did want to start by recognizing a very dear mentor of mine. Dr. B. Kalish, you can see here, this was at my graduation ceremony and when she became a living legend of the American Academy of Nursing. Dr. Kalish passed away earlier this summer. She lit up the room with her laugh and her smile, and she was the one that shared with me very early on in my career, don't let anyone tell you no. You do what you think you can and continue to achieve. So I wanted to recognize the leadership in which this lectureship is named in, and also a very dear mentor, friend, almost mother to me when I was here for almost 11 years at the School of Nursing through my undergraduate and graduate studies. With that said, a little bit about my background. I have had a wonderful career experience working in health policy. When I came out of nursing school my senior year, I was, like many nursing students, wondering where I was going to go, what I was going to do. And what happened was I had the wonderful opportunity to meet Dr. Kalish. And I went in, and I was telling Ashley this earlier, I went into her office just to schedule an appointment. And she came out of her office with the biggest smile and said, "What are you here for, and how can I help?" And I said, "I'm here to schedule an appointment with you, Dr. Kalish." She's like, "Well, just come in right now." And I was definitely not prepared. I had on, I remember it distinctly because the style is coming back in, but a sundress with like spaghetti straps. And I'm like, I am not prepared to meet this wonderful, incredible woman. And she said, "This is going to be your plan. You're going to take the GRE, you're going to take the NCLEX, and you're going to start in my program in the fall." And knowing Dr. Kalish, that is exactly what I did. So while I was in my graduate program, I had the opportunity to do some amazing experiences. One of them was to work in my congressman's office. And on the third day in his office, the chief of staff said, okay, you are a nurse. Your father owns a small business. You're going to write the congressman's floor speech on health plans and small businesses. I said, okay. So sure enough, with the help of the chief of staff or the press secretary and the health LA, we wrote these words. And later that afternoon, the congressman shared those words on the House floor. I still to this day have the congressional record where that is included. I was sold. I said, I am never coming back to Michigan. I am going to be a DC native. And I was hit with the Potomac bug, as they say. But the reality is, Dr. Kalish called me and said, you got into the PhD program, come back to Michigan. So that's what I did. But after I graduated, I had amazing experiences working at NIH, the American Association of Colleges of Nursing, where I became a registered lobbyist. I know that terminology is like, oh gosh, registered lobbyists are like down here on the trust level and nurses are up here on the trust level. But it was such an empowering experience to be able to take the voice of nursing to the decision makers on Capitol Hill. And I had the chance to be part of legislation such as the Affordable Care Act, the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, the Investment Recovery Act, all to get nursing provisions in that legislation. And so that has kind of launched my career. It's a very different environment on Capitol Hill now than what it was when I worked there. That's a little bit what I want to talk about today. Is about how do we make these courageous connections? How do we impact change? And it can be done at every level. So one thing is we're post-pandemic, or so we think. There's still cases of COVID everywhere, as we know, but really the impact that COVID had on health and on wellness. So I want to ask a few questions. Raise your hand only to the first, because that's the one I think is the most interesting. Do you think your social connections have changed since the pandemic? If you think they have, raise your hand. Absolutely. What new, you don't have to answer this, but what new connections have we sought out after the pandemic? Do we ever avoid connections because of perceived conflict? I know sometimes I avoid talking politics with my father, but there are these conflicts that we know, and the divide is getting bigger. And is it harder to build trust? One of the things that we also have found out after the pandemic is this incredible weight around misinformation and what it does to impact what we know about health and how research changes it. And then, do you think the impact you make is changing, or has it maintained? And as we think about that, I wanted to focus on 4 concepts: the concept of isolation, the concept of connection, trust, and impact. So starting with that first one, isolation. This is a crisis. So the Surgeon General came out in 2023 with a report on isolation and loneliness. And what he said was, our epidemic of loneliness and isolation has been an unappreciated public health crisis that has harmed individual and societal health. Our relationships are a source of healing and well-being, hiding in plain sight, one that can help us live longer, more fulfilled, and more productive lives. But a part of that, we know that approximately half of US adults are experiencing loneliness, with higher rates among younger adults. We know that the rate of loneliness among young adults has increased every year since 1976 to 2019. So what does this data tell us? So the data tells us that as we look across 148 studies with an average year length of 7.5 years in that study period, that loneliness has increased, loneliness and social isolation increases the risk for premature death by 26% and 29% respectively. Lacking social connection can increase the risk of premature death as much as smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day. Social isolation among older adults alone accounts for an estimated 6.7 billion in excess Medicare spending annually. These data points help us understand the impact of connectedness, loneliness, and isolation as a public health crisis. The Surgeon General's remarks in that study said, this advisory report that was released in 2023 shows us how to build more connected lives, a more connected society. If we fail to do so, we will pay an ever increasing price in the form of our individual and collective health and well-being. And we will continue to splinter and divide until we can no longer stand as a community or a country. Instead of coming together to take on the great challenges before us, we will further retreat into our corners, angry, sick, and alone. So as we think about this impact of social isolation and loneliness within the American community post-pandemic, but even before that, we want to think then, what are the connections? How do we build those connections? So this next piece, I think, really helps illuminate that point. Social connection has increased the odds of survival by 50%. 50%. So taking that time to go out, meet with friends, meet with people in your community, to connect with people across multiple settings, not necessarily with the screen in front of you, but true connection increases survival by 50%. So the Surgeon General report talks about 3 distinct capacities, and I wanted to mention those briefly. So structure, function, and quality. So when we think about structure, it's the household size, the friend circle, who's in your social connection. From a function perspective, it's the emotional support, mentorship, support in a crisis. I spoke about my mentor, Dr. Kalish. We need mentors, we need supporters, we need champions and friends. The last piece is where I wanted to go, quality. Relationship satisfaction, relationship strain, social inclusion or exclusion. What is the quality of our connections? So what is a quality connection? We could say that it is family, friends, our churches, our communities, our professional societies. We could even say social media. Yet almost half of Americans in 2021 reported having 3 or 4 close friends. Only about a quarter of that stated the same statistics in 1990. So we have less closer friends than those that did in 1990. What changed? What is impacting those social connections? So I wanted to provide a few statistics for you. The first one, 8.2 billion people in the world. 4.9 billion are on social media. By 2027, that number will grow to 5.85 billion individuals on social media. It is a huge platform for people to connect, to engage, to soak in information. When we think about almost half, more than half of the world is engaging information in this venue, that impacts how we provide care, that impacts how we engage, it impacts how we can make a point or a statement. So a little more details on that. 145 minutes is the average amount that a person spends on social media a day. The average number of social media accounts is 7.1. Now, I have to tell you, I didn't know there were potentially seven social media platforms to be on. And one of the reasons why I think this is so funny, back in 2009, one of my staffers said to me, Suzanne, you're not on any social media. You have to be on social media. And she signed me up for a Facebook page. I'm not kidding. It was like all the stars were aligning. I get an email from Facebook that my account had been hacked and that a new email was attached to my Facebook account. So I'm like, wait, I have a Facebook account? I'm like, oh, yes. Lisa set it up so many years ago. And I finally figured out to get online, and the meta universe makes it so difficult to try to figure out how to cancel your Facebook page. I was able to successfully do that. Everything on there was like a blast from the past because it was all 2009. I'm like, oh, that's what I was doing in 2009, apparently. But 7.1 social media accounts. That's huge amount of volume of how we're interacting in our days. This last data point, if you were to live 73 years with these statistics, you would be spending 5.7 years of your life on social media. 5.7 years. I didn't know if I want to spend 5.7 years on social media, but that is what those average statistics come out to. When we look at this a little bit more in context of what's happening right now, in 2023, it was estimated that 95% of youth ages 13 to 17 report using social media platform, with more than a third saying that they use it almost constantly. I have 2 children. They're not at this age group yet, but any chance they can grab a phone, an iPad to be on some sort of platform, they will. And as we think about this, what came out from the Surgeon General, and many of you may have seen these 2 reports, social media and youth and mental health, and then the best-selling book, The Anxious Generation, and how the great rewiring of children is causing an epidemic of mental illness. Social media is a huge impact on our youth, but also adults. So it does have a harmful influence, as we know. In a study conducted among 14-year-olds, it found that social media use predicted poor sleep, online harassment, poor body image, low self-esteem, higher depressive symptom scores, and this is a larger association with girls than boys. As we look at the majority of parents and adolescents, they are somewhat or very extremely worried that their child's use of social media could lead to problems with anxiety and depression, lower self-esteem, being harassed or bullied, feeling pressured to carry out a certain way, and exposure to explicit content. Another random controlled trial among young adults and adults found that the deactivation of social media platforms for 4 weeks improved subjective well-being by about 25 to 40%. So it has a huge impact on psychological wellness and mental health. As we think about social media and its impact, the Surgeon General report calls it out. It has a huge impact on how we take in contact, how we make our social connections, and what that means for our health. I'm not sure if you saw this latest report. On September 11th, 42 state attorney generals came out and called for putting a label warning on social media, similar to tobacco. 42 state attorney generals. That is the impact that social media is having, whether we recognize it or not. With that said, though, there is always that other line that we have to be careful of. Social media can also be a source of belonging and inclusion for many, and it can support mental health, well-being, positive identity, or affirming content. And I think from that perspective, one of the studies that was cited in the report specifically stated that social media may support the mental health and well-being of gay, lesbian, bisexual, asexual, transgender, queer, intersex, and other youth by enabling peer-to-peer content and feeling that they have an identity within a network. So we do have to understand that as much as it can cause concern, it is a safe haven for others. So to that end, I wanted to talk a little bit about trust. These concepts are all interwoven. So this is where we start to think about the impact that it has. And as you know, we are in election season, and I'm not here to comment about the election season, but I am here to talk a little bit about what that means during election season. So in 1972, 45% of people said that they trusted each other. In 2016, that was only 30%. And the numbers keep going down. So the trust that we have in each other has significantly decreased. And as that changes, this corresponds to the level of polarization that we're experiencing, and they are at historic highs. The phenomenon is combining to widespread effects on society, including many of the pressing issues that we face as a nation. Polarization and different views are incredibly huge. So I wanted to talk a little bit about trust because we know it so well. Our patients have to trust us. Our families have to trust us. Our communities have to trust us for them to feel that they are receiving the best care and the care that is culturally, linguistically appropriate and sensitive to their needs. So when we think about the types of trust, there's generalized trust. Generalized trust is, I met Ashley earlier today. She seems really nice. I think I trust Ashley. It's generalized, given to individuals that you meet and engage with. Particularized trust is the trust that you have between individuals you already know. So it's the individuals that you engage with, your family, your friends, your networks, your coworkers. You may grow to trust them through a very distinct new level because it is more of relationship based. And then there is institutional trust, the trust that we have in our government and in our institutions across various settings, whether it be professional, government, local, federal, or state. So as we think about that, it is a very rapidly changing environment about trust, however. Now, I'm probably going to embarrass my wonderful niece, Flora Ramos, who's in the audience with me right now, but I'm sure you've all heard the term going viral and how different images, TikTok feeds, whatever it may be, goes viral. And when we think about this term of going viral, it is just the environment that we're living in now with social media and the ability to put out information so rapidly, it makes easier for misinformation to also spread just as rapidly at a scale and speed we have not seen in our lifetimes, probably in many others' lifetimes. So this concept of going viral, that everyone's picking it up, is really quite impactful on the way that it impacts how we receive information. So you can see there's a thread here. This is all a public health crisis that we're talking about. Loneliness, connection, misinformation. These are what the leaders in our public health community are thinking about. The Surgeon General came out with a report in 2021, shortly after the pandemic, around confronting health misinformation. Addressing health misinformation requires a whole of society effort. And in the report, he talked about health misinformation is a serious threat to public health. It can cause confusion, sow mistrust, harm people's health, undermine people's public health efforts. And the limiting the spread of health misinformation is a civic and moral imperative that require a whole society effort. So what happens when misinformation goes viral? Does anyone remember during the pandemic when there was the conversation that if you mix alcohol, you could make hand sanitizer? Okay. So people were doing social media threads about making hand sanitizer, particularly with Tito's vodka. And Tito's vodka came out and said, do not make hand sanitizer with our product, essentially. to combat the misinformation. And many people would just say, oh, well, we're healthcare providers. We know that's not ever going to happen. You know, we're informed individuals. But the spread of how quickly that moved forward, what we found later after the pandemic, and research has studied this, is that Tito's correction of misinformation actually was incredibly important. So when we think about how fast information moves, it moves because it's sensational content, and it can be emotional. I'm looking at the audience. I don't know how many Swifties are out here, but when we think about just how big it was on Tuesday night, I mean, that almost eclipsed when Taylor Swift endorsed Kamala Harris for president. That almost eclipsed everything else that was happening in the news. And commentary was flying every other way because that was consumed on social media. It was sensational, it was emotional, depending on how you feel. And then the urgency to react. Social media is so fast. It may take me a day or two sometimes to respond to people's text messages, but people have this urge to respond so quickly and without doing fact finding on social media. And the other piece about social media is, as I mentioned, the unprecedented speed and scale, but also the incentives people receive from social media. The likes, the positive comments. People get all of that information, and so it is a really important tool that people use. However, one study found that false news stories were shared 70% more likely to be, false news stories were more likely to be shared on social media 70% more times than any other media outlet. So social media is diffusing misinformation constantly. We also know that social media takes us in one direction, all algorithms. If you like one post, you're going to get more content and more content and more content on that post. How do you be informed of the full issue if you're being driven to only one side? So to that end, I wanted to turn it a little bit to politics. Now, back many years ago, and I apologize if these names are unfamiliar, but I wanted to give this example. And this is where the idea and the concept of what we have now with social media and the urgency and the response and the sensationalism and the emotions started. So in the summer of 1968, it really changed how Americans consumed politics. In 1968, President Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King were assassinated. The country was engaged in the Vietnam War. Race riots were breaking out on the streets. It was one of the most tense political climates ever. And at the forefront of this time was the presidential election. And at that time, it was Nixon versus Humphrey, Hubert Humphreys, Richard Nixon, okay? And there were two leading commentators at the time, Gore Vidal and William F. Buckley. So Gore Vidal was a leftist in what we would consider today's time. He was the cousin of Jackie Kennedy Onassis. He was a taboo smearing novelist, but very well respected in his community of more leaning towards the Democratic side. He was a lifelong Democrat. William F. Buckley, however, founded the National Review magazine in 1955, and he was the head of the new conservative movement in the United States. So ABC News was at the bottom, dead last in its rankings, dead last. They decided that they were going to have the political commentaries for the events be Gore Vidal and William F. Buckley, who were on the extreme polar opposites of political ideologies. And what happened in that was that they came to both the Republican and the Democrat National Convention, And they were the commentators, much like we saw over this summer with our um, uh, 2 national conventions at these events for AABC. Now, this is a PBS documentary, and I highly recommend it if you are a history buff. But what they discovered in this is that they believed each other's political ideologies were absolutely dangerous to the United States of America. Very similar to how our 2 presidential candidates think the ideologies of their competitor are. And during their time on stage, they pummeled each other with personal attacks. Personal attacks. It was heated, it was unscripted, and they went at each other. And ABC's ranking shot up. And that is the change in how political commentary is so different today than it ever was before. They really opened the door to be political, ambitious individuals commenting to narrate and speculate and create a spectacle. So with that, we know that this has changed how we as Americans have talked about politics. And this comes back to that time. So what I wanted to share for you is that what has changed in America is that growing ideological divisions are fueling skepticism and even animosity, you all know this, between groups across the political divides. Sentiments of enmity and disapproval between Democrats and Republicans have more than doubled between 1994 and 2014. And so as we think about that, what we're looking at is, are we open-minded? Can we create a connection with someone whose view is so contrary to us? Can we have that conversation? Republicans and Democrats differ in how they describe themselves. Democrats, as you can tell from this Pew Research Center's report, share that Democrats find themselves more open-minded, that they can have more conversations, that they can listen well, where Republicans consider themselves more traditional. Republicans lean that they are more skeptical of what experts say. So going back to that concept of trust and institutional trust, Republicans are more skeptical of what our institutions say. Respect for authority still maintains high amongst both parties. Comfortable with taking risks. I find this interesting, that it's kind of balanced when it comes to Republicans and Democrats. But I think overall, when we look at these statistics, we know that there is a change and a shift. So I wanted to play for you a short video. It's about 5 minutes, so bear with me, but I think it really illuminates the point. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Adam Grant. Adam's Grant work, he is a professor at the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. His body of work really focuses on organizational psychology. And Firing Line, a show that came out of the controversy with William F. Buckley at the time, now still being run today. During Firing Line, they interviewed Adam Grant on just what I was trying to make that point. Thank you.
Your bestseller from 2021, Think Again, The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know, helps make the case to readers that the ability to rethink one's own opinions and assumptions is a critical characteristic for success. One of the places where this is most difficult and least acceptable is in our politics. I want to give you an example. Representative Adam Kinzinger, a Republican from Illinois, came to Congress in 2011, completely opposed to any kind of gun reform legislation. He still calls himself a defender of the Second Amendment, but just last month, he signed on to the first bipartisan federal gun legislation in almost 30 years. He reevaluated his thinking after mass shootings in El Paso and Dayton. And you and I both know that it is almost impossible for elected officials to change their mind without being called flip-floppers or without really being attacked for being seen as weak.
Yeah.
How can we make it more politically tenable for political leaders to re-examine their thinking in the face of new evidence and circumstances?
That is such an important question. It might be the defining question of our time. And I think the starting point for me is to recognize that changing your mind doesn't necessarily make you a hypocrite. It might mean that you've learned something. And the question is, why are you changing your mind? It's not whether you've changed your mind, right? It's why. If you're changing your mind because you're trying to cater to your constituents, then I think it's reasonable to ask, is this person flip-flopping? Do they have real integrity?
Flip-flopping is an opportunistic change of mind.
Yeah, exactly, where you're basically abandoning your principles, and now I have questions about your moral character. But learning is when you change your mind because you encounter better logic or stronger evidence. And if you don't change your mind in the face of new facts, then you are basically closing the door to evolving. And last time I checked, learning is not about affirming what you already believe. It's about evolving what you believe. This is what I would ask. This is exactly what I would ask politicians to do, is I would ask them, what are your current principles? And what are the conditions that would change your mind? And if they pre-commit to the evidence and the information that would lead them to shift, then all of a sudden, when they evolve according to that information, when the world changes, they change with it. Now I know they're learning and they're not being hypocrites. And I don't think we spend enough time asking politicians to explain, okay, look, I know you're a supporter of the Second Amendment. And I know right now what that means is you're trying to protect the right to bear arms in a variety of ways. What kinds of events in America would have to happen to lead you to wonder if we're taking that freedom too far? And if there aren't ways to give people that freedom and still protect them from mass shootings? Maybe we could even fulfill both of those values at the same time. Maybe.
I mean, as you know, there are many people in our politics who would pridefully say, there are no circumstances or conditions under which my mind would be changed. And they would be rewarded by their voters for taking that position.
Do you really think that?
In the base of the Republican Party, absolutely.
I'm not so sure.
Tell me why.
Well, I think that first of all, there's a risk that some of these candidates end up looking completely stubborn and inflexible, right? And nobody wants to be led by a politician who refuses to ever learn. Now, the question is, are there some single issue voters or maybe sacred issues where people are okay with that? Sure. So maybe we don't start on guns.
Okay, so then let's take this approach to my skepticism. Because as you know, many Republicans still believe that Donald Trump won the election, and they believe in Donald Trump's election lie, that Joe Biden is an illegitimate president. If you were face-to-face with an election denier, how would you make a persuasive argument?
This is really hard. I don't know if you can make a persuasive argument.
Because there are some people who simply won't engage with the possibility that they're wrong.
Yeah, so the first thing I would do is I would get out of preacher and prosecutor mode. I'm right, you're wrong. Right? The harder I work to proselytize my views and attack yours, the more likely you are to disengage altogether. Or when I show up in prosecutor mode, you bring your defense attorney to court, and then neither of us is willing to budge. What I would do is I would sit down with that person and say, it sounds like you are really convinced that Donald Trump won the election. What evidence would change your mind on that? And if you say nothing, which I've had happen, I say, okay, I just wanted to be clear, this is a religion for you. This is an article of faith that you take as seriously as your faith in God. No matter who you spoke to or what information you saw, you're not gonna budge. And most of the time, people backpedal when I say that. And they say, well, no, of course, if I were to see the following, I would reconsider. And that's then a little bit of a foot in the door, right? You're not necessarily gonna change their mind in that conversation, but changing people's deep-seated beliefs, especially when they're consistent with their hopes and dreams, is not an overnight project, right? It's almost a lifetime commitment. And so what I want to do is I actually don't want to make an argument in that conversation. I just want to get them to reflect on if there's anything that would change their mind. And guess what? Now they're in the driver's seat. They feel a sense of ownership over their own beliefs. They're not under threat. They don't have to put up a shield.
Most of the folks that you talk to will cite the things that they've seen in the media because they trust their trusted media sources.
And that's the kicker here, right? When people believe things that aren't true, when they're drawn to conspiracy theories, it's the problem is not one of information, it's one of trust, right? They are, generally speaking, if you look at what draws people to conspiracy theories, they are looking to feel, generally speaking, people want to feel like they have unique knowledge. Mm-hmm. They want to feel that they're in control in a world that feels out of control. And so it's much more comforting to believe that there are a few powerful people that are orchestrating the system for their own gain than to believe, you know what, sometimes the world is unfair and I'm the victim of that.
You write about binary bias and the human tendency to seek clarity by simplifying every issue into two categories. So adding complexity and nuance is actually a way out of our hyperpolarization.
Yeah, binary bias is all around us. And the more charged an issue is, the more likely we are to take a complex spectrum of issues and beliefs and oversimplify it by dumbing it down into only two categories. I love Robert Benchley's take on this when he wrote that there are only two kinds of people in the world: those who divide the world into two kinds of people and those who don't, right?
So thank you for bearing with me, but I think Dr. Grant really does put the salient points together. That we have to have these conversations where we're open to hearing different perspectives and truly trying to understand the other individual's perspective. And this concept of binary bias, of black and white and nothing in between, is really what we're seeing in the United States right now, this polarization across the country. And so I wanted to put this into the context of how do we move policy forward in such a dynamic setting in which we know people are not connected as they used to be, people are isolated, they feel disconnected, there's loss of trust in their institutions, in their generalized trust, as well as the particular trust. So policy is really like a dimmer switch. We turn it up, we turn it down, depending on the issues. Right now, we're in lame duck. It's presidential election. We're not going to move a lot forward. But policy really is about people, beliefs, and action. So to put that in perspective, I'm sure you all know who these individuals are. But these are the individuals in power right now within the administration, the House, and the Senate. And as we look at the people, they are going to be the ones that help make the decisions for what rules, laws will regulate your practice, the care your patients receive, how much insurance they get, the cost of medication, you name it. If it has a federal implication, we look to our leaders on this. And how much are we weighing in on those issues? So one of the great books, it's a bit older, by Deborah Stone, it's called The Policy Paradox, The Art of Political Decision Making. But what she describes in it is the struggle over ideas. We see the struggles over ideas on any political hot button issue, as Dr. Grant said. But how issues are framed and the values that policymakers attribute to the issue impacts the decisions and the public's understanding of them. When we think about decision making, whether it be the decision leaders within the institution here at University of Michigan, the School of Nursing, the state government, or otherwise, there is a premise, a basic premise around this. Nearly 70 years ago, Herbert Simon published his seminal work on policy choices. And what this work says is that individuals are not rational actors. You bring your beliefs, your experiences, your background to decision making. Individuals are also limited by their cognitive and environment constraints, what they know. I think about this when I go up to Capitol Hill anytime. I will have a member of Congress, their staff say, I have a sister, a brother, a cousin, a friend, an aunt twice removed who's a nurse. You guys do great things. They can't tell you how you were educated. They can't tell you how we make an impact in the hospital setting. And yet they are to make decisions on healthcare. And so it is so incredibly important, not that it's because they don't care necessarily, but it's because of their environment they grew up in, or what they know about the healthcare system and how they make their decisions, or more importantly, what their staff know. And compromises are made by adapting to the situation. So I wanted to talk about that piece of beliefs for a moment. So again, on this concept of how policy is made, it's this assumption that all these things tie logically together. We decide what's the target population we are trying to address, who are we trying to help. We think about the values that are attached to the policy decision. We think about the rules that are governing or constraining the action, and what is the rationale for that policy? And overall, there are 5 democratic values: equity, efficiency, security, liberty, and community. Now, how you apply your decision-making to those 5 processes, or those that are in positions of impacting policy decisions, may depend on your worldviews and lenses. So to put this all together of how decisions get made and sometimes when they go wrong, I wanted to give this example of the No Child Left Behind Act. I'm not sure if you're familiar with No Child Left Behind, but the legislation was introduced in March of 2001. And it was intended to ensure all children, regardless of socioeconomic status or race, had a quality education. And President George W. Bush signed the bill into law in 2002. And behind that, the frame, remember Dr. Stone said the struggle over ideas is the frame about how we want to put around it. Who wants our children not to have a good education? The frame of No Child Left Behind, if you don't do your investigation yourself of what this legislation was, it looks great, it sounds great, no child in America is going to be left behind. You can see in this photo that right above George W. Bush is Senator Kennedy. Senator Ted Kennedy was a Democrat of Massachusetts. It was bipartisan legislation. And the frame, as I mentioned, with no child would be left behind, it was something that all Americans could get behind. And those values that were attributed to it were equity and community. But the struggle that came out of this legislation was that it focused on test scores and held schools accountable by penalizing them if there was no improvement in the children's scores. So at the end of the day, what we're looking at in this particular case is that while it may all look good, we have to investigate what those ramifications would be at the end of the day. So I wanted to bring us back to that last piece around impact. So we know as a country, we are less connected to each other. We know as a country, our political ideologies are farther apart than we've ever seen in a significant period of time. Many would probably say more significantly than what was happening in 1968. We know that our social media is taking the information out there, whether it be truth or misinformation, and spreading it at a scale that is almost possible to keep up. We're spending apparently 145 minutes consuming this information every day. So when we think about what can we do to make impact, whether it be policy or otherwise, I want to share a few examples of what's in the Surgeon General's report, but then also talk about my experiences and how I feel that as a community and being engaged in policy, we really need to be thinking about the next step forward. But what the report says is design the built environment to promote social connections. Now, for a hospital setting like this, you probably have the opportunity for social connections much more than my office, in which we are 2 days in the office. And then those 2 days, over a course of 5 weeks, you may see one person in the office, one person, that's across the country. We don't have the same social connections. So how do we promote social connections overall? How do we establish and scale community connections and programs together? We've seen a significant drop in individuals maintaining their membership or their partnership or relationship with churches, for example, whether they be a church, a synagogue, or otherwise, we've seen that decline. Invest in local institutions that bring people together. From a public health perspective, we need to establish social connection as a priority health indicator and a social determinant of health. We all know the social determinants of health, but social connection needs to be one of them. There's this great book also, I'm just going to put it out there if you're interested in policy and particularly the social determinants of health. It's by Daniel Dawes. It's called The Political Determinants of Health. And the political determinants of health is similar to the social determinants in which the laws that govern us impact our health. And that's a whole nother lecture for another day. But The other piece for researchers is establish a social connection as a research prioritize and standardize measures to collect data on social interaction and connection. In our workplaces, make social connection a strategic priority in the workplace and nurture relationships. We need mentors. We need individuals that are going to lift us up. We need colleagues, we need friends, we need communities. We need all of those for our health. It is incredibly important. For healthcare workers, explicitly acknowledge social connection as a priority for health and integrate social connection into patient care and into the EHR. These are policy recommendations that's coming out of the Surgeon General's report. We need to be asking our patients what connections they have, who's picking them up. These are just basic questions that we run through in our mind every day. But how do we know if they're completely isolated, if they're lonely, if they have no one that can help them with their treatment regime? Invest in longer term efforts to build resilience against health misinformation. We all can be a part of trying to reduce the spread of health misinformation. We need health literacy programs. We need programs for health professionals. We can take the cue out of Tito's vodka. And we need journalists and librarians and all of them trying to create this world. We also have to avoid binary bias, as Adam Grant talked about. And to that end, we can't see things in black and white. We have to be able to see the gray point. So in closing, I just wanted to talk a little bit about where we think about all of these pieces, the integration and what we're about to have as a country, an election that may be very divisive after the results are out. To be more intentional in our connections. We have to be a bit more courageous in who we meet, how we engage with them, because there might be some other people that need that connection just as much as you do. Remain authentic in your work and remain authentic and work to find shared values. I may have a political ideology that is different from some of the friends and family I have or colleagues that I have in Washington, D.C. But if we can find shared values like equity or community that we want to move forward, we can see positive gains. Actively work to establish and evolve trust. I think that's understated. When you jump out, at least in my world, when you jump out on a Zoom and you see someone for a few minutes and they're trying to sell you something or they're trying to make an argument for one way or another, it's hard to build that connection. You have to have a relationship before that trust can come. And then most importantly, to model the way. Everyone in this room has the opportunity to reach out, connect in different ways, build their own connection, and model it for our youth, because our youth are incredibly struggling right now. So I appreciate your time. I know I went about 5 minutes over. My apologies. I'll blame the wonderful Dr. Adam Grant. But it is an incredible opportunity to be able to speak with you today. I am so passionate about the ability to maintain and sustain relationships, because I do think, as Dr. Grant said, it will be how we change our political connections. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions?
My name is Joe. I'm a nursing director on 12 West Monroe Pediatric Medical Surgical Units. This very presentation, I feel, is a great capture of when we make an offering that's both available in person and Zoom. Our culture since 2024 is that so much has shifted to Zoom and the convenience of Zoom, but it really does lack that connection building. Even as we've tried to encourage it in our areas, there's still like a lot of pushback about access and availability, and that it should come with a hybrid model. How do we shift? or find the right balance between where Zoom is something that we can leverage and gain the benefits of it, but then also not deteriorate all of our connection that you get from having meetings in person.
It's a great question, and one that leaders across the country are struggling with, whether it be industry, business, corporations, nonprofits. Because at the end of the day, we want to provide flexibility. We want them to still receive the content, but at the same time, do it in their own terms. And I think that it's going to take a lot of growth over time. And the more that there's this older theory by Dr. Goldstein, he's a political scientist, and he talks about and I'll put this in the context of politics for a moment, but he talks about political participation. And you have to, for individuals to get engaged in political participation, you have to ask someone and show them how. And I use this in the context of sometimes it means that social connection of asking a colleague, hey, I'm going to this event, would you come with me? And it's that building connection over time, that one-on-one connection that really I think is going to be a lot of work, but a way that we can get people more engaged, because having the flexibility to watch and understand and learn is incredibly important. And it is that flexibility is maintained and sustained in so many ways. But I do feel at the same time that that disconnect, we don't want to see individuals continue to disconnect or continually to opt out of social interactions because they prefer Zoom. And in those cases, I would think that there might be a scenario where you need to ask them and bring them to the table. And they may go unwillingly, but I do think it's going to take time. But that's why there's so much emphasis on social connections, because it's easier, it's more convenient, but we don't necessarily see the impact that it's having us when we choose to step away from connection. Thank you for that question.
I just want to thank Dr. Miyamoto for just a very thought-provoking presentation. And we actually have a lot more in common than I thought. Okay, B. Kalish was also very much a supporter of mine in my doctoral program. And I had the privilege of being part of the Nightingale ceremony in hospice about a week before she passed. So she's very, very dear to all of us. In 1982, my master's thesis was on the impact of social isolation, alienation, and depression on suicidal ideation. And for 40 years, I have been concerned, as social media has progressed, how the impact of that will be, particularly on children, in social isolation. And we can see that the data is terrifying. I just want to thank everybody for coming. And just to remind us, when we co-created Nursing at Michigan more than 20 years ago, we did it on a set of principles. Some of those were around community. We invited everyone, patient, family partners, interprofessional partners, and nursing across the organization and the school. Diverse voices and opinions always, to create anything that we were doing and the impact that we made, not only on the health system, but in the world, is a result of that. So I want to remind us that we are always part of that community. And we have that history, and we have that opportunity as we move forward. So I want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank Julie and Dean Hearn and the teams for inviting Dr. Miyamoto. I also want to thank Dr. David Spollinger, who generously created this lectureship. So thank you all for coming, and have a great day.